A new report by the Centre for Development and Enterprise is calling for a radically new approach to small business development. The executive director of CDE maintains the stagnation of the small business sector and government inefficiencies warrant the handing over of the reins to allow the markets to shape the future of entrepreneurship in South Africa. The executive director, Anne Bernstein, joins me this evening to unpack that very report. Good evening, Anne. Thank you very much for joining us on the SABC. So the CED report is calling for that new approach to the development and support of small business, which would largely require the participation of the private sector. Just take us through, firstly, the issues identified around the development of small business.
Well, we all agree that we want a dynamic and innovative small business sector in South Africa. And for a long time, we have said that the state is going to promote small business.
Yeah.
And in 2014, we set up a department of small business to do that. And we spend something like 6 billion rand a year on direct funding of small businesses through the state. But the truth is, we're not seeing the results. Our small business sector is pretty stagnant. It's the government itself says that there are low survival rates, there's inadequate support for small firms. And if you think about it, it doesn't make sense to assume that an official who, through no fault of their own, generally has no experience of business or running a business or supporting a business, would be the best people to help drive an innovative and dynamic business sector in South Africa. Mm-hmm. So we're saying, take the money and let's take half of it as an experiment, and let's push private sector funders, banks, lenders of all sorts, let them compete in a transparent way for this money. And if you look at the medium-term expenditure framework, that's this year, next year, and the next year, 3 years, it's about 18 billion rand. We're saying take 9 billion rand and let's get the private sector to manage that money and to help drive a much more dynamic and innovative small business sector.
How would they go about doing this? Because you're saying 6 billion was for direct funding for the small businesses, and beyond that, there have been no positive results yielded. Let's start with just the problems there. Beyond the funding, what was needed? Was it hand-holding that would have been needed, mentorship, incubation? Where were the problems? Because now if we're saying we're giving the money to the private sector, they will administer. It then says to me, who's listening, that is it an administration of funds problem, or was it here where you were giving entrepreneurs the money, but there was no incubation process or mentorship?
The truth is we can't really answer. So this money in the state is spent at national, provincial and local levels, and the information is just not there. We're not given an indication of who is chosen for support. How much does each firm get for support? How do they do after the support? Are they growing? Are they closing down? Are they employing more people? We just don't have that information in government. So we can't really answer the question. It's a whole range of activities, and it's all about inputs. We give X amount of money to 100 farmers. Mm-hmm. Well, that doesn't tell us anything about what kind of support has worked. Mm-hmm. So if we're not really interested in the input, we're interested in the impact on growth and employment.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly we would be interested in the impact. But if we don't have the granular details around why these entrepreneurs being given the 6 billion have failed, how then easy is it to come up with the solutions, which in this instance the report indicates would need the private sector to manage the funds now? Because again, it takes us to a situation where we start to suggest that it was the administration of funds that was the problem, not necessarily that there would have been the issues around greater support beyond funding for these entrepreneurs.
Look, there's something like 300 organizations in government that provide all sorts of support to small businesses. About 28 organizations provide funding, direct funding, and they do all sorts of things, but there's no evaluation on what works. Now, what we're saying is leave some of those monies in the state, but take half and let's, in a very transparent way, get the private sector to do this, say 3 to 5 funds. Now we're also saying once a year, we want those private sector funds to report in Parliament, have a special event focusing on small business. Let's see how they've done. How did they spend the money? What impact have they achieved against which criteria? Growth of firms, growth of employment, or whatever. But at the same time, we should get the public sector actors, agencies in this field, they need to also account transparently, clearly to Parliament and the public on how they spent their money and what impact they had. So it's a big experiment. We're saying we're much more likely to get a more dynamic small business sector through the private sector, but let's experiment. Let's open it up. Let's have more transparency.
Yeah.
Let's push the private sector to go lower in the market, to support more startups, more small firms with potential. Because that's what we want. We don't want lots and lots and lots and lots of small businesses. We want lots of firms that are thriving and that move from being small to being slightly bigger and then bigger. So we've got to be clear on what we're trying to achieve. And at the moment, the way in which it's being handled through government is extremely opaque.
And we have been told for the longest time that small businesses were going to become the focus because they would be the greater employers as opposed to the bigger enterprises. But since 2014, as you say, very little has been shown for all the support, financial support. So you're saying that at least with the private sector, if anything, we're going to get transparency. They can come to Parliament and account for how they've administered the funds.
And we should get the public sector too as well. This is a lot of money. 6 billion rand a year is an enormous amount of money. And it's shocking that we don't actually know what value we're getting for that money, especially at a time when we can't manage our budget very well. So that's one of our big recommendations. The other big recommendation is we should stop talking about getting rid of red tape or regulations. We don't know what's happening. The government set up a red tape unit or task force. We want a much more powerful merging of two entities in the presidency. We want an SME test. They do this in a number of countries where regulations and laws are assessed for the impact they will have on small businesses in particular, and we need to get serious about this. Every year we should report what regulations have been removed, what did we hope would be achieved, what has actually been achieved, has this affected prices? So a real focus on deregulating our state in order to say that small firms are 10, 20, 30 people. They don't have big HR departments. They don't have all the resources of an enormous mining company. We need to minimize the hassle, the regulations, the delays in licensing and everything like that so we can get more entrepreneurs succeeding.
So do away with the bureaucratic inefficiencies, if you will. And thank you very much for your time this evening. It was certainly a very interesting report and quite instructive. And possibly government will consider some of those recommendations. That's Bernstein from the Centre for Development and Enterprise there speaking to us.